International Studies Public Forum for the year. I gave a lecture at the Model UN Convention this weekend, and every sentence that you ended, this is the last lecture of the year, the students would go, woo, woo, you know, so I'm noticing the difference here. High school students are much more enthusiastic about these kinds of things. But we are very happy today to have Miles Kahler. Came up from UC San Diego. Miles Kahler is a Rohr Professor of International Relations and Pacific Studies and Political Science at UCSD. When he was at UCSD, while he was at UCSD, he still is, he also has directed the International Studies Program, founded the Institute for International Comparative and Area Studies there, served as an interim dean for IRPS and a host of other administrative roles. He's also a sought-after policy advisor. He served as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in the 90s and as an advisor to the Asian Development Bank now. His research and published work covers a wide range of topics that range from decolonization to debt restructuring, to global governance, regionalism, post-conflict state building, and most recently, he's published a book on networked politics. His wide-ranging interests have drawn many students into his orbit, including myself. Miles Kahler was on my dissertation committee and has been a valuable mentor throughout my career. So it's a great honor to have him here today, and he's going to speak, as the slide suggests, on Asia and the reform of global government. So please join me in welcoming Miles Kahler.
I'm glad Deborah Evans gave you the most important part of my CV, which was that I was on her dissertation committee, as she mentioned, which dates both of us, I suppose, somewhat. But I can certainly say that it was one of the best dissertations that I've participated in, so UC Irvine certainly was very, very lucky to have her here directing the International Studies program. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's very much on everyone's minds, I think, these days because of the Great Recession. It was a theme, or it's been a theme over the past decade, particularly with China's rise, and now more generally Asia's rise. I'll talk about who exactly is rising in a minute. But with the Great Recession, some have interpreted that recession, that event, which began unusually at the core of the world economy in the United States and then spread first to Europe. It wasn't like the Asian financial crisis or the Latin American debt crisis, in which it was the peripheral economies that engaged in crisis first. Some have taken that to be a sign of, in some sense, the economic decline of the West. And that what we're seeing now is an irreversible shift in global economic and political influence from West to East. And for example, a well-known columnist for the Financial Times, Philip Stevens, has played on this theme a great deal. He wrote in December of 2009, in the depths of the Great Recession, and I quote, "The rise of Asia maps the most obvious of geopolitical shifts. At the turn of the millennium, the talk was of a unipolar world," this is 10 years ago, "a unipolar world in which US hegemony stretched into an indefinite future. The startling speed of China's rise has confounded all expectations. In a blink of history's eye, the march of power from west to east has become the central unnerving fact of geopolitical life." And then he goes on to mention India also as part of this general rise of Asia. And just last week, in fact, a few days ago, in the wake of the deal that Turkey and Brazil forged regarding the Iranian nuclear program, he wrote a piece which was titled, "Rising Powers Do Not Want to Play by the West Rules." So that's the second theme, which is not only is Asia, or the emerging economies, not only are they rising in relative power, but they're not going to play by the same rules. They're going to fundamentally reshape the global rules of the game. Now, you may think that's a good thing or a bad thing. What I'm going to do today is first describe to you the prevailing wisdom, which runs along these lines, and then I'm going to question it for most of the session. And then I'm going to come back at the end, having come to a rather optimistic conclusion, which for me is very unusual, and add a certain note of pessimism about the future at the very end of the talk. So first of all, what's the prevailing wisdom about the rise of Asia? First of all, the Great Recession has clearly produced a widespread demand for reform of global governance, particularly global economic governance. That means the institutions and rules that have been primarily shaped by the countries or the entities that I'm going to call the incumbents. That's the United States and the European Union, and to a lesser extent, Japan. And these demands, both domestically and internationally, for overturning the rules of, there are no demands domestically or internationally for overturning the rules of the game as there were in the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's fairly clear. But there are clearly demands for extensive reform so that we will not have a similar crisis in the future. So that's the first step of the conventional prevailing wisdom. Second, the Asian emerging economies, China at the head, but also India, Indonesia, the three big economies in Asia, as well as other large emerging economies such as Brazil, have done well during this crisis. They have had, it wasn't that it did not have any effect on them, but certainly it did not have the kind of severe effect that it had on the industrialized economies. And generally they have continued their upward economic trajectory. And that points to, finally, more Asian influence, especially emerging Asian influence over global governance in the future. And because of that, the final part of this logic is that global governance will change to reflect that influence. In other words, there will be a different type of global governance in the future because of the growing influence of Asia on it. So as I said, I'm going to spend most of my time questioning this prevailing wisdom from a political perspective, and then I'm going to kind of hedge my bets by offering a somewhat more pessimistic scenario which suggests that maybe some of this is in fact true. But first, let me give you my assumptions quickly. I'm going to define global governance for the purposes of this talk as global economic governance, and particularly the global economic multilaterals. The big three, the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF, but also financial regulation, which is governed, to the degree it's governed at all, by the Bank for International Settlements, and now the Financial Stability Board. And I'll leave aside other types of global governance, but we could easily extend this type of analysis to other key areas like environmental policy and climate change, and even further afield, areas like human rights. But for now, we'll talk about global economic governance. I'm going to use Japan and China as my primary proxies for Asia, as I did in the paper that was posted before this talk. That's a little unfair. There are many other countries in Asia. I've already mentioned Indonesia, and certainly India. But when we talk about the two biggest economies in Asia, we're talking about Japan and China. And I'm using them as proxies to clarify, in many ways, the kind of empirical argument I'm making, because there's a lot of talk here, and in that quote that I gave you from Philip Stevens, he talked first about Asia, then he talked about emerging economies. Sometimes people talk about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, or BRICSAM, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, ASEAN, and Mexico. All these sometimes clustered together as emerging economies. But for the purpose of this talk, we'll concentrate mainly on Japan and China, and I think there are good cases to take because as the two biggest economies in Asia, they could give us a sense of what Asia in general is likely to want out of global governance and where it's likely to go. Somewhat more controversial point, though you wouldn't know it looking at the press today, is that the growth in emerging Asia, particularly in China and India, will continue rapidly as it has in the past. Now, it's true that as economies converge on the technological frontier, their growth tends to slow down. This has happened to Taiwan, it's happened to South Korea. And at some point in the future, it's going to happen to China. Those who are expert on China sometimes say that China has to grow rich before it grows old. And it's a race against time in that sense. So I accept this for purposes of argument, but it's of course important to look at the case of Japan, which was in 1980 being touted as #1 in the world economy, or as a future #1 in the world economy, and of course has endured 2 decades of economic stagnation since the early 1990s. So we should be careful about these simple projections. I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that lower income Asian economies will continue relatively rapid growth, and that those predictions certainly continue today. Just to give you one example, the National Intelligence Council produced a study in 2008 called Global Trends 2025, projecting ahead to the world of 2025. The National Intelligence Council argued that they will collectively match, Brazil, Russia, India, and China will collectively match the original G7 share of global GDP by 2040 to 2050. In other words, by the midpoint of this century, those four will match the entire GDP of what are now the rich industrialized countries. And last week, everyone's favorite investment bank, Goldman Sachs, predicted, and it was someone at Goldman Sachs, by the way, who invented the term BRIC. And so they have now what is called a BRIC monthly that they put out regularly about these countries. And their monthly report, which just came out last week, began with this phrase, these sentences. The last decade saw the BRICS make their mark on the global economic landscape. Over the past 10 years, they have contributed over a third of world GDP growth and grown from 1/6 of the world economy to almost a quarter of the world economy in purchasing power parity terms. And then this is their prediction. Looking forward to the coming decade, we expect the trend to continue and become even more pronounced. In other words, these emerging economies are going to continue to grow rapidly and perhaps even more rapidly than they have in the past. So the final part of my assumptions is that we can assume that these countries are going to continue catching up to the incumbents. Not only will they grow rapidly, but they'll grow more rapidly than the United States and the EU, which they have certainly done in the last decade. Now you can question these assumptions, any of these assumptions, very easily, certainly the last two. And I can tell you, if you change the curves, these curves, and this gives you a sense, this is just to give you a sense of how rapidly things have changed. This is the original Goldman Sachs, one of the original papers that initiated the term of the BRICS back in 2003. And this was their prediction of when China and India's GDPs would exceed today's rich countries. Okay, so you can see in the case of China, the idea was that it would exceed, total GDP would exceed the United States somewhere well out into this century. And in the case of Japan, it was estimated sometime around 2015. I think that's what I can see from this perspective. Okay, so this is now the rankings. So just since that was done, that projection was done in 2003, we now know that China is already the second largest economy in the world. If it's not now, it will be next year or this year. So that projection, which showed it was going to take on Japan out here, has now already been moved back considerably to 2009, 2010. You can see how dramatically things have changed in one decade. China had a smaller economy than Italy 10 years ago, and now it is equivalent to Japan, and the only larger economy in the world is the United States. So these, pretty well known, but quite dramatic change. You can see why you get this kind of boosterism on the part of Goldman Sachs and others regarding the emerging economies. Now, how do we think about these claims that Asia's rise will influence global governance in a dramatic way? I have a background in international politics, so to me the way you start is you think first about capabilities and then you think about preferences, and that's the way I'm going to proceed today. In other words, what capabilities do these countries have or will they have to change global governance? And then, okay, so they have the capabilities, let's assume they do. Do they really want to change global governance? In other words, or how do they want to change global governance? What are their policy preferences with regard to global governance, which is the second part of the story. So first, national capabilities and how we think about them, and I'm going to do this fairly quickly. Basically, it's a combination of economic characteristics combined with the institutional rules of the game in particular issue areas. So in the case of trade, generally, we think about capabilities in terms of market size and access. And that means that in the trade regime, the United States and the EU have been the dominant players for most of the time that we've had a GATT or WTO since 1945. The Asian economies clearly have substantial commercial power in these terms, although it is limited by WTO rules, which prevent all members of the WTO from substantially closing their markets once they have opened them. Nevertheless, in terms of market size and growing, the ability to grant access to these rapidly growing markets, this is an area where one could expect that the Asian economies would have substantial capabilities and they would be able to influence the trade regime over time. Monetary and financial power is more complex, and I discuss this at greater length in the paper. One way of thinking about monetary power is how can you, whether a country can minimize its adjustment cost and the political costs that are associated with those economic adjustment costs. And one measurable element of this capability is reserves, which also receive a great deal of attention on the part of the Asian economies in particular. And as you know, the countries that have the largest international reserves in the world are in Asia, China and Japan. And in general, since the Asian financial crisis, the last decade, Asian economies and developing economies in general have built up their levels of international reserves, largely as an insurance against the recurrence of such financial crises. And that is indeed one of the reasons they came through this crisis more easily than the larger and richer economies. What do these reserves mean, however, in terms of influencing other countries directly? And here the interesting question is how China's buildup of reserves, the US treasuries, will have an influence on American policy over time, or could China influence us because it has reserves of this kind? And here I cite the work of Dan Dresner, who's written on this, and I tend to agree with him, that actually in bilateral bargaining, reserves and the ability to bargain with the United States because of a creditor-debtor position in this regard has been pretty limited up to this point. And the other area that is often cited for monetary power is key currency status. And here the Asian economies have not done very well. Asia, in fact, is probably the region that keeps the dollar in the predominant position that it is, because there is not an Asian currency alternative. The yen, sort of half-hearted efforts at various times by the Japanese government to make the yen a key currency has not really succeeded. There's some talk now, of course, that the renminbi, the Chinese currency, will become another key currency in the world in competition with the euro and the dollar. But despite the difficult times that both the dollar and now particularly the euro are having, they remain the two kind of key international currencies, and there really isn't an Asian equivalent. Whether there will be in the future, of course, is something that would influence the influence that these economies have in the monetary sphere. And then finally, the area of financial regulation. This is going to be very important in reform initiatives going forward. There's obviously a lot of debate in the United States about our domestic regulatory stance, and that is linked to international negotiations over where financial regulation will go, all aimed at trying to avoid the kind of crisis that we've just been through. And here, once again, the key indicator is probably market access. Do you have a large financial market? And can you induce other countries to accept your regulatory wishes by threatening to deny them access to your financial markets? This is something that the United States and the holder of the other big international financial market, London and the UK, have used to some effect to ensure that their regulatory views have been paid heed to over the last few decades. Okay, so here, once again, it's a little hard to see, given that Asian financial markets are not as concentrated as they are in Europe and the US. There is no market equivalent to New York and London yet in Asia, although Asia is certainly a rising financial power. It's difficult to see at this time what level of power or influence over regulation Asian countries would have internationally at the global level. Now, even if Asian economies or Asian governments have these growing capabilities because of their rapid economic growth, that, of course, does not ensure that they are going to win when it comes to global governance outcomes, because they have to pursue some kind of strategy to translate those capabilities into outcomes. And this has been, I think, a barrier. I describe this in more detail in the paper as well. In both the case of Japan and China, there have been limits to the amount of engagement that they have pursued with these international governance structures. And there has been a considerable reluctance on their part to accept the costs of leadership in these regimes. It's clear that simple measures of capabilities do not translate for either China or Japan automatically into influence over institutions and outcomes. And here, both countries have demonstrated, Japan in the 1970s and the early 1980s, China in the 1990s and the first part of this decade, it may be changing now, they've demonstrated a real lag in their perceptions about their economic weight in the world economy and their potential influence. They have tended to see themselves as much less significant in the world economy than they really are. And in the case of China, this has been reinforced by its developing country status. In other words, it's kind of refrain that you get from the Chinese leadership very often, that we are a poor country, we're a developing country, we don't have hegemonic ambitions. It's not really for us to take on the burdens that might be required to lead in these areas of international economic policy. We may want more influence, but it's not clear that we want to bear those costs. As I say, in China's case, this is reinforced by its developing country status, a country that still has persistent poverty and low per capita incomes. So in both cases, rising capabilities, actual demands for influence, strategies to pursue greater influence have lagged considerably the growth in capabilities. And as I point out, it took Japan until the late 1990s to attain the status of the second highest quota within the International Monetary Fund. That's a very long time after Japan had achieved the status of second largest economy in the world. And only recently, really, has China begun at the global level to seek the kind of influence that is attached to its status, given its capabilities in these areas of trade, money, and regulation. But even more important, perhaps, than the strategies pursued by these aspirant powers is the fact that the incumbents have counter-strategies they can pursue. And they have pursued them very well, in many ways. In other words, they do not have to give up influence in these institutions. It's a very fine line for the EU and the United States. They want these institutions to be effective, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, which means that they want to have these emerging economies as active participants. But of course, they just as soon these active participants went along with their point of view, right, and didn't ask for too much influence. And this has been a particularly grating point in the International Monetary Fund, where European countries actually have, by most measures, overrepresentation. And the United States sort of stands aside and lets the Asian and European governments, in some sense, fight it out. But also, Europe and the United States have been very, very effective up to this point in maintaining a duopoly on the leadership positions in the IMF and the World Bank. And that's a good example of a counter-strategy by these incumbent powers. This convention, it is nowhere in any kind of written rule, but a convention that the head of the IMF should be a European and the president of the World Bank should be an American. And that's the way it's been for 40, 50 years. And once again, it's not written down anywhere, but because of their incumbent power within the organizations, Europe and the United States have been able to enforce that convention. Now, they have claimed recently, in the midst of the crisis, as a concession to the emerging economies, that that's going to end. But I will believe it when I see it, and we will see what happens in the next round when either the head of the IMF or the World Bank decides to step down. So far, it hasn't happened. So that suggests that the incumbents in this case are not passive bystanders. They can conduct strategies of resistance and delay that prevent these rising economies from assuming more influence in the structures of global governance and in these institutions. Okay, so national capabilities, strategies, counter-strategies. The other option for these countries is to combine their capabilities with others. And I think this has been the hope for many about China, that China would become, in some sense, a leader of the opposition, if you will, to the United States and Europe in the world economy. China as, kind of taking on the incumbent powers on behalf of the developing countries. But there's really little evidence, certainly in the prior case of Japan, even less, but even in the case of China, there's very little evidence that they wish to be the leader of such a coalition of the developing countries in particular. To date, China has not chosen that role, and in the WTO, where it's most likely that China could play that role, China has defined its interests very differently. In fact, China's interests are much more like the US and the EU. It's a very big, it's a very diversified economy. It's not dependent on commodity exports like many developing countries. Many developing countries quietly will tell you that they're fearful of China because of its tremendous competitive power in manufacturing. And in fact, many developing countries have levied protectionist measures against China. For example, China's recently had an unpleasant little trade dispute with Argentina over trade. So the idea that China is sees its interest as necessarily aligned with other developing countries or will act in that regard just doesn't seem to be the case. At least we don't have much evidence to date within the WTO or these other institutions that China wants to play that role. Now, more significant is the possibility of regional institution building and the possibility that Asia could develop regional institutions that would give it bargaining power, more bargaining power than any of these individual countries could obtain on its own. And this gets to a second project I've been working on. Debbie mentioned it in her introduction with the Asian Development Bank, which is just finishing a report called Institutions for Regionalism about the future of Asian regional institutions. The Asian Development Bank, some of you may know, certainly wants to play the role of the Secretariat for developing Asian institutions and has been promoting the development of more Asian regional institutions over the past few years. So this report and the studies that led up to it are designed in a way to make the case for more regionalization, more institutionalization in Asia, which compared to Europe and North America really is pretty under-institutionalized. It doesn't have the same level of institutional development, regional institutional development that these other parts of the world do have. So this would be important for global governance for two reasons. First of all, it's another variety of coalition. So if there's an Asian coalition which combines China, ASEAN, Japan, and the other, India perhaps as well, in some sort of regional institution, that provides more weight, bargaining weight, potentially, within these institutions than they would possess if they went their individual ways. But second, it gives Asia what I've called an outside option. It allows Asia to threaten that if you don't give us our way within global institutions, we have an alternative at the regional level, and we might just take up that alternative if you don't go along with us. Now, I'm not sure that Europe and the United States have ever made that kind of blunt argument about withdrawal from global institutions. You don't have to if you have the outside option. But I think it's clear that in the European case, certainly in the 1980s, when there was talk of Fortress Europe, and after the 1980s, when the United States picked up regional options like NAFTA and free trade agreements, that this became a much more threatening possibility for other countries in the world, and it did give them more influence within the trade regime. What is the likelihood that there will be an Asian economic community? What is the likelihood that there will be a more developed Asian regional identity that would be institutionalized? I have to say, even though I participated in this project, that I'm somewhat pessimistic for a number of reasons. There are a number of very, very big obstacles in Asia as compared to other regions. First of all, Asia is, and here I'm talking about Asia as a whole, including South Asia, India, and Pakistan, is much more heterogeneous on two key dimensions than the other big regions in the world, Europe and the United States, or even the Americas taken as a whole, US and Latin America. One dimension is economic disparities. The gap between the richest Asian countries and the poorest Asian countries is larger than it is, much larger than in Europe, and larger even than it is in the Americas. So you have a divergence in interests within Asia between very poor countries like Laos, for example, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, or Burma, and very rich countries like Singapore or Japan. It's also very heterogeneous in political terms. The Americas, with the exception of Cuba, are largely democratic in their political regimes. Europe is exclusively democratic. The Middle East is pretty homogeneously authoritarian, with some exceptions. Asia is a complete mix of political regimes. It ranges from very competitive and vibrant democracies like South Korea to some of the worst authoritarian regimes in the world like North Korea and Burma or Myanmar. So in those terms as well, it's likely that interests are going to diverge when you come to creating regional institutions. So a very heterogeneous, obviously a very large region, but also a very heterogeneous region. And another obstacle is the distribution of power. There's no obvious leader in Asia, and there's no obvious collective leadership in Asia. In fact, the two obvious leaders in Asia, Japan and China, have tended to pursue regional designs as a means of pursuing their rivalry with each other, not cooperation with each other. For example, China prefers, when it thinks about Asian institutions, prefers what is called ASEAN +3. Take the Southeast Asian countries, add China, Japan, and South Korea. That's the kind of grouping that China prefers, because that would maximize China's bargaining power. Japan understands that, so Japan prefers ASEAN plus 6, which brings in Australia, okay, New Zealand, and India. Right? 3 democracies to counter China, and also 3 countries, at least 2 countries out of those 3 that are aligned with the United States, like Japan is. So there's kind of competition about what will Asia look like just in terms of the size of the regional grouping. And China and Japan have very different views on this. That's only one example. The point is, unlike Europe, which was founded on a reconciliation between France and Germany, Asia is disadvantaged by the continuing rivalry between Japan and China, which, despite the new government in Japan and its initiatives in this regard, does not show many signs of diminishing. Asia is also externally dependent in ways that other regions are not. In economic terms, Asia, despite its rapid growth, remains highly dependent on European and American markets for its manufactured goods. If you look at the pattern of trade in Asia, the vast networks of production that get you your Apple iPads and iPhones and all the other consumer electronics that we treasure in Europe and the United States, they're all based in Asia. The manufacturing is now almost all based in China, but the final markets are not in Asia. The final markets for these goods are still largely in Europe and the United States. Now, the markets in Asia are growing, no question about it. There is a rapidly growing middle class in countries like China and India that like the same sorts of electronics and other goodies that we like, but it's still smaller than Europe and the United States. I mean, we think about Europe and the United States as being on the ropes right now, and in many ways they are economically, but just in terms of sheer level of income and wealth, they still remain very, very, very big parts of the world economy. And in terms of consumer goods and the markets for consumer goods, they're still very, very important for Asia. Equally important is the fact that Asia remains dependent for its security. At least some of the countries in Asia remain dependent for their security on an outside power, the United States, which gives the United States leverage over any kind of regional institutions that are going to emerge in Asia. And the United States governments have always been quite happy to use that leverage if they see something happening in Asia that they do not like an Asian monetary fund, for example, in the late 1990s. And finally, there are institutional shortcomings. Some of you who have studied Asia know about the ASEAN, so-called ASEAN Way. Asian institutions, almost all have the following characteristics. They delegate very little power to permanent organizations of any kind. The secretariats are very small and relatively weak, if they exist at all. They're exclusively intergovernmental. In other words, in Asia, you do not find any examples of courts or dispute settlement mechanisms that give access to individuals or corporations, the way that you do in Europe or in North America, to a much more limited degree in North America, but nevertheless they do exist. They're very weakly legalized. The obligations in Asian institutions tend to be relatively imprecise, not very binding. And the decision rules are always consensus decision rules. In other words, it's very hard to find any Asian institutions which make decisions by any kind of qualified majority rules. So they're kind of lowest common denominator institutions. They move as quickly as the most conservative or most reluctant member will allow them to move. And all of this makes it very difficult for the institutions themselves to channel the capabilities of the countries in Asia in any kind of coherent direction that would shape global governance. Now, this could be changing. The key institution, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has now formed a charter and seems to be moving in a much more coherent and legalized and formal direction. It's not going to become the European Union anytime soon, but it's definitely a break, at least on paper, with the past. Whether it's actually going to be implemented or not, of course, will depend on a lot of things, and not the least of which is the domestic politics in the ASEAN countries is pretty tumultuous right now, as you know from the events in Thailand. So all of this suggests that, just to sum up, that regional institution building will proceed in Asia, there's no question about it. But to see a credible outside option in Asia that would give them bargaining power within global governance I think, is something that's well out in the future. It's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So let's turn to the next set of questions, which is the preferences that these countries have over global governance. Because even if they have capabilities, and if they're able to enact strategies or build coalitions that allow them to reshape global governance, the question is, do they want to reshape global governance? Is there anything that, any particular set of policy preferences that they have that would set them apart from the incumbents, the EU and the United States? What is it that Asia wants in global economic governance that is not already embodied in the existing institutions? Well, there are two possibilities. One is that they would like a different type of institution. I've already mentioned, going back, that Asian institutions they're a very particular style of institution. They're not at all like the European Union. They're not even as precise in their legal obligations as, say, NAFTA. So it's a very different style of region. Maybe if the Asian institutions, the Asian countries had more power in international life and global governance, they would want global institutions that look like their regional institutions. In other words, global institutions that were weaker, less binding, more consensus-driven, less intrusive, all the things that people think the IMF and the World Trade Organization may be. But that's a plausible argument. The problem is that if you look at what Asian countries have demonstrated at the global level, they don't show any signs whatsoever of disagreeing with the format of these institutions. For example, Japan was one of the leaders in introducing a dispute settlement mechanism into the World Trade Organization when it was being designed in the 1990s. Japan, which we think of being very skeptical of kind of Western legalism, in this case saw the dispute settlement mechanism, this kind of legal device within the WTO, as a way of restraining the United States. China, when it joined the WTO about a decade ago, accepted a protocol of accession to the WTO, which was, to most people's view, I think, amazingly stringent, very demanding. The Chinese government not only accepted that protocol of accession so that it could get into the WTO, it has actually implemented it. And there have been a number of reviews of what China has and has not done. But in terms of its basic commitments to the WTO, they have been fulfilled. And I want to emphasize, this meant that China had to change its legal system in quite fundamental ways to bring it into compliance with WTO rules. So there's not a lot of sign that if these countries had more influence, they would choose a different type of global regime, largely because in the case of both Japan and China, they see these global regimes as one way of constraining the United States, especially in areas of trade, and have therefore supported, in fact, these mechanisms that at the regional level they have been very skeptical about. Okay? So it seems unlikely that they're going to move in a very radically different direction. But more interesting and more controversial is, do they have different preferences over the policies that these global institutions would pursue? In other words, will they finally attack and undermine the so-called Washington Consensus? Now, the Washington Consensus, what is it? Well, if you talk to John Williamson in Washington at the Institute for International Economics, the guy who coined this phrase, he will tell you it has been completely pulled out of context and made into something he never intended, which is this kind of horrible, market-oriented, orthodox, grinding, oppressive, US-led wish to kind of reform the world in a totally market-oriented direction. He had a much narrower definition of what the Washington Consensus was, but once you put a phrase out there, you don't have any control, you don't have a copyright. So I think he sort of has to live with the fact that it has become a kind of broader concept, the idea being that it is something the US, and to a degree the Europeans in fact, a set of market-oriented policies like privatization, rolling back the state, opening your borders, ending not only trade restrictions but also capital restrictions, and a whole host of market-oriented measures of that kind that that the United States and Europe have tried to implement around the world. I don't think, in fact, things have been that indiscriminate, or it's that easy to encapsulate what the IMF and the World Bank in particular have aimed for in the last 2 decades, but that's the kind of view. So what about the Asian countries? Would it be possible that they would try to change the Washington consensus, undermine it, maybe put in their own consensus in place of it? If you look at the history of Japan and these institutions, back in the early 1990s, Japan did try to question the Washington consensus. And there was a famous study that I mentioned in the paper called the East Asian Miracle, which was an effort by Japan to, in some sense, give its view of why East Asia succeeded. And it meant that the state actually had a role to play, that government was very important. It wasn't all about markets. And the Japanese, in some ways, pursued this line throughout the 1990s. Now, of course, as the Japanese economy looked less and less successful in the 1990s, the Japanese model also became less appealing as well. But there was a shift in official positions, and that's an important fact to note. The Washington Consensus today is not the Washington Consensus that was in place in the 1980s and early 1990s. The Washington Consensus today, if you look at, for example, the behavior of the IMF during the recent crisis, the managing director of the IMF, Mr. Strauss-Kahn, was a cheerleader for fiscal stimulus in the early part of the crisis. Not the standard IMF line. It was very much sort of pumping up the world economy through allowing the Europeans and the United States to introduce fiscal stimulus. Not the orthodox line one expected from the IMF. The IMF no longer endorses an unrestricted relaxation of capital controls. In fact, the IMF has produced some research papers lately which suggest that capital controls may be, in fact, okay, even a good thing in certain cases. So partly because of pressure from Japan and other dissident countries, the Washington Consensus itself has shifted and become much more nuanced and much less orthodox and rigid than it was, I think you could argue, in the 1980s and early 1990s, at least in some circles. But then the other interesting question is, well, if Japan was not able to introduce an alternative to the Washington Consensus, what about China? China clearly is a very different model. China is a very market-oriented economy in many ways, but it has a very large state sector. And it clearly has a background as a socialist economy and a leadership, which is a communist party, that is very different from the current G7 on a whole host of dimensions. Is there something called a Beijing consensus? And could it be exported into global governance? And would that change the character of global governance? Well, here once again, and I do not claim to be an expert on this, but whenever you see the word consensus, whether it's Washington or Beijing, I think you could be prepared to be skeptical about these things. And I would be skeptical for 2 reasons. First of all, it's not clear to me that China has a rigid model of development that it could export even if it chose to. Most of my friends, like Barry Norton, who is a specialist on the Chinese economy, I think, would argue that the Chinese model was in certain respects a non-model. It was all about experimentation, gradualism, a mixture of state intervention and market reforms that is very hard to characterize except by pragmatism, perhaps. And it's not quite clear how you export pragmatism. And it's, as I've already mentioned, the Washington Consensus itself has become more pragmatic in recent years. But the other reason is that China itself, as a principle of its foreign policy, and also because it wants to fend off interference by others in its own internal affairs, as a principle of its own foreign policy, is it does not want to interfere in the affairs of other countries. And therefore, the kinds of conditionality that have been associated with the Washington Consensus would be extremely unlikely to be implemented by China. And we have seen that, of course, in recent days in the ongoing crisis over North Korea, a country where China has every ability to intervene in various ways, but has chosen for various reasons, principled and otherwise, not to do so. So finally, conclusion, and this is the optimistic conclusion. I'll get to the pessimistic one in a moment. The optimistic, if you like the current structure of global governance, economic weight does not equal immediate influence over global governance. at least in the short term, and the limits that these countries have on their engagement and their willingness to bear the costs of global governance are big limitations on their ability to use their capabilities in this way. The incumbents, the EU and the US, resist and accommodate. They pursue a delaying strategy to maintain their own influence in global governance quite successfully. There are limits on coalition building by these countries, both outside the region and inside the region as well. So the regional option is relatively weak, at least for the foreseeable future. And finally, the preferences of these countries, even China, are basically aligned in many ways with the existing norms and principles of these institutions. And that's really for a fundamentally domestic reason, which I note here, which is their legitimacy. And this is true of most Asian governments. Their legitimacy is based on economic performance. And they have tied their economic performance to a particular economic model, which is dependent on an open international economy. So to the degree that these institutions seem to suggest or seem to guarantee such an economic orientation globally, they're going to support them probably, pretty much in the form that they exist. Now that's the optimistic, or if you're looking at it from the point of view of the global institutions, it's the optimistic view. Now, what about second thoughts? After I wrote this paper, because I'm a pessimist by nature, I looked at the conclusion, I thought to myself, this is very unusual, because I came up with a relatively optimistic conclusion. And then I started thinking about ways that this could go off the track. And there are several. First, it concerns the domestic politics within the countries of emerging Asia. All the reforms of global governance that are being talked about today that are going to have any effect whatsoever will involve more international surveillance of national policies. Either macroeconomic policy, regulatory policy, you name it. But the idea is that there will be more international surveillance so that, for example, the United States would not be able to go its regulatory way and allow the subprime mortgage market to bring down the rest of the world economy in the future, and so forth with other countries. That's going to pose real problems for these emerging Asian economies. It's politically very sensitive ground for them to have international institutions intruding themselves into their domestic policies, particularly for China, but also for India and the other large developing economies. More specifically for China, China's political system, its authoritarian party state, has difficulties in collaborating within the current structures of global governance for at least two reasons. One is simple transparency. It's not a transparent political system, and that makes it difficult to collaborate economically and in other areas with China. And second, the role of the state, which I've already mentioned, which still remains much larger, much more prominent, and there are no signs that the current leadership is going to change that. Much larger and much more prominent than it is in other industrialized or rapidly growing economies. And finally, there's the question of persistent poverty and the incentives to free ride. And I think this is very important. This is the first time in modern world history, I think, in which we have economies that are both large, in other words, they can affect the rest of the world economy and the international system, and they also remain poor. Typically, when countries became large enough to affect the world economy in the past, the recent past at least, they were also getting rich rapidly. The United States, in some respects, was always a rich country compared to the European countries at the time. The rapidly industrializing European countries like Germany, in per capita terms, became rich at the same time as well. But let me just show you here, skipping ahead. This is another graph from that original Goldman Sachs study about the BRICS. This is a difference. This is per capita GDP. Okay? The original chart I showed you was, now this would have to be adjusted because China is catching up more rapidly than they thought even in 2003. But notice the scale. This is percent of US per capita GDP. 40 is the top. So China is reaching 40% of US per capita GDP out in the middle of this century. Okay? At that time, it would already, by most estimates, have surpassed the United States as, in absolute terms, as a larger economy. But nevertheless, in income terms, it would still be lagging far behind, and of course, India as well. Now, there are those who are now predicting that China will catch up more rapidly in per capita terms. This curve will be inflected much more sharply. But it's clear that in per capita terms, these countries are not going to catch up as rapidly as they will in absolute terms. And that raises interesting questions, because countries that have a lot of poverty internally are going to think very carefully about how much they want to dedicate to global engagement and global leadership. There will be a tendency, probably the free ride, and frankly, just thinking about it philosophically, when we think about issues like climate change, it is an interesting question. I mean, a very difficult question as to how much should a country that still remains poor, even if it's a very big country, a big economy, how much should they be expected to contribute when so many of their population remain well below the income levels of the current industrialized countries. But here I'm talking mainly about the political dynamic, which is going to give strong incentives for these economies to free ride. I have talked about this as a strictly economic issue. For those of you who work on international politics know very well that this also has foreign policy implications, and they can spill over into these economic domains. But I'm not so sure this is going to be that different from the past. We have scholars like Randy Stone at Rochester who have done very, very intricate studies to demonstrate that the United States and the Europeans have always interfered for political and foreign policy reasons in these institutions, like the International Monetary Fund. So if China decides it wants to help out its client states, probably that level of manipulation and political intervention is not going to bring down the structure of global governance. I said that the likelihood of regionalism in Asia is relatively low, but what is called defensive regionalism could get much more powerful in Asia if the global governance structures do not accommodate Asian demands for more influence. It looks like now they are going to, at least gradually. But under two sorts of conditions. Either the global governance institutions do not respond to Asia, or there's another large economic shock to Asia and the Asian economies from the outside that they see as being based somewhere else, outside the region. That could give them a much stronger incentive to build up regional institutions. That need not undermine global institutions, but certainly there would be a risk that it could if regionalism took a particular form. And finally, active proliferation. This is a more general problem. It's not just Asia participating more actively in global governance, but more countries. Right? You all probably have seen that the new presiding entity in the international economy, the International Economic Management Center now, is the group of 20, no longer the group of 7 or the group of 8. The group of 20 expands the group of 7, the industrialized countries, to include many emerging economies, and it includes, in fact, of 20, it includes 6 Asian or Pacific economies or countries. But by expanding to 20, or by bringing in more actors in general as they are demanding into these institutions, you face a big trade-off, because more actors probably means harder decision-making, more difficult and cumbersome decision-making, and that can mean that these institutions become less effective. They become less effective, they can also become less legitimate. So you have two types of legitimacy, basically, that you have to weigh. One is the legitimacy of inclusion, bringing in more actors to make these institutions more legitimate, hearing more voices. And on the other hand, effectiveness. The more effective institutions are, the more legitimate they are. And these two actually have to be weighed against one another, and they do not move in the same direction. So there are my more pessimistic final thoughts. On balance, I still tip toward the more optimistic view on the stability of the global governance structures we have today. But I would temper that optimism, say it's tempered optimism at best, given these final considerations. So thank you.
All right, we have time for questions. Did you?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes.
I recall the title of a book, and I'm sorry to say that I do not recall the name of the author, but perhaps you are familiar with it. It was written in about 1910. The title was The Great Illusion.
Yes.
And the author of that book advanced the very cogent argument that since in the modern world, industrialism made it possible for nations to grow wealthy beyond their wildest dreams and the aspirations of their peoples through peaceful industrial development and peaceful trade, ergo, expansion of the nation's tax base and the government's wealth by imperial conquest was no longer necessary legitimate or in any way defensible. And furthermore, intelligent leaders of nations recognizing this would restrain their governments and peoples and prevent any big wars from happening or lasting very long if they did start. Of course, this book was written about 4 years before World War I. Actually, it was called at that time The Great War, singular. They only amended its name to institute that it was to reveal that it was the first of a series of world wars after the beginning of the second one. But to what degree do you believe we can sit back and relax, confident that there will be no more big wars? I personally believe that this is laughable if it weren't so sad an illusion, and confidently expect to see another major war, you know, on the scale of World War I or World War II in my lifetime, and I'm 65. But I'm a pessimist too.
You are very pessimistic. That's Norman Angell. Norman Angell, and yes, it's a very famous book. It's actually it's a very interesting and I think a book that people should reread, because just because World War I occurred doesn't mean that the logic of his argument is wrong. But of course there are many, many differences today as compared to the era before World War I, the most prominent being nuclear weapons. Right there, if you look at the explanations for what is called the long peace, which people have been commenting on for some time, which has existed now since 1945. We've not had a major, it doesn't mean we haven't had wars, we've had many wars. We've not had a great power war since 1945. The explanations people give are various. Some of them are similar to Angell's in the sense that John Mueller suggested just that, you know, great power war of any kind, even conventional great power war, is so horrible to contemplate that governments stay away from it. But nuclear weapons clearly changed the game to a degree. And I think most people see a lot more caution on the part of great powers. And I think you can make the same sort of argument that Angell made, too, to a degree that governments, most of the major governments today at least, have primarily ambitions that are not those that created the conflicts of World War I. In other words, they don't have pressing territorial claims against one another. They may have territorial claims, but they're not typically against other great powers. They don't have deep ideological divisions any longer. So there are any number of explanations for the long peace. But I do think the technological one, though I'm typically not a technological determinist, I do think, you know, nuclear weapons have had an impact. And that's a big difference from the pre-1914 era. But there are lots of other reasons that one can imagine, even in a world without nuclear weapons, although we can never achieve a world in which we have collective amnesia, no one knows how to make nuclear weapons, but in which there are no nuclear weapons in place, which is the ultimate goal that President Obama has suggested, one could imagine a lot of reasons why great powers wouldn't go to war. All the great powers today, and this is one of the themes of emerging Asia, they are, even China, though they're a very authoritarian government, they're responsive to their populations in ways that governments in the past were not always responsive. I mean, the Chinese government is extremely sensitive to its economic performance. It knows that, you know, its other forms of legitimacy are rather limited, but economic performance is one thing it has gotten very right. And as a result, when the economy looks like it's going off the tracks, as it did temporarily in late 2008, early 2009, they jumped in with a major stimulus package, much more impressive in a way than the United States stimulus package, not because they were being cooperative internationally, but because they were concerned about the reaction of their population. And most populations, most of the time, are not really interested in getting involved in great power wars, I think. So we can assume that even if China's not democratic, the fact that it's responsive may have a positive effect as well. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious as to what you think about what the future for the ASEAN countries are. Do you think it's going to become more like the EU, or is it just going to stay how it is? You mentioned it a little bit, but could you just expand on it a little more, please?
Well, the ASEAN countries it's a little bit of a paradox, because they were always at the center of building Asian institutions in general, and their model of institution building was always dominant. In other words, they did not want, and they were quite explicit about this in the past at least, they did not want to be Europe. They did not want these formal institutions that were highly legalized and highly developed. But they reached a point in terms of economic integration in this decade in which they decided that they had to become, in fact, more like Europe. And that's where they claimed to be moving in terms of building an economic community a security community, and a cultural community. They have 3 pillars of the ASEAN community, and even the language that they're using now is European in that respect. One of the things that's moving them in this direction, of course, is China. They are concerned as a fragmented group of 10 countries that they cannot present an economic unit internationally that will be as attractive in the international economy, especially to investors, but to other economic actors as well, as China. And so by integrating more deeply, unifying more, I think they see themselves as, in some sense, offsetting the rise of China economically. That certainly was one of the motivations for their free trade area in the 1990s, which they've developed. So they've made some progress in terms of economic liberalization. Their free trade area has removed most tariff barriers among its members. On non-tariff barriers, probably not so great. They haven't done all that much in terms of financial cooperation outside of the ASEAN Plus 3 framework. So, whether they have whether the politics of the ASEAN countries will allow them to move very far down this road is not clear. There are conflicts between them. There's a border conflict, for example, between Thailand and Cambodia. There's domestic political difficulties. Thailand obviously is in total political chaos at the moment. They're very, very different in terms of their political systems. They have instituted a human rights charter, which I think a lot of people were surprised at, given that they have always had a strong line about not intervening in each other's domestic politics. So it's a little hard to say where ASEAN is going at the moment. I think largely because the key countries are all a little uncertain. The Philippines have just had an election. Thailand is totally polarized, and it's a very significant country. And Indonesia, which is by far the largest of the ASEAN countries by population, has always played a somewhat reluctant leadership role. They don't like playing a high-profile role, so they're not the obvious leader of ASEAN. And at the moment, they've now been inducted into the G20, so they have sort of global aspirations. And I think have gotten a little bit frustrated with ASEAN and how slowly it has moved. So it's hard to say. As I say, on paper, the aspirations are there to become something more. But it's not clear they're going to be able to get there anytime soon. Yeah?
How much do you see like demographics, like China's aging population, and like internal environmental problems and like unemployment and those things, like perhaps slowing China's economic growth this decade?
Well, that's, that's, as I said at the very beginning, this brick mania that people have, that these countries are going to continue to grow, at sort of these high-speed growth rates forever. Yeah. Just in economic terms seems a little unlikely as they converge on the industrialized countries, but also there are just so many bumps in the road that you could hit. No one thought that Japan would have a banking crisis in the early 1990s that would slow its growth so that it became the slowest growing industrialized country for 20 years. And that's a pretty extraordinary change. In 1990, 20 years ago, Japan was regarded as a real competitor with the United States, as a rival of the United States economically. It was going to maybe even overtake the United States. So Japan is a real cautionary tale. There are lots of things that governments and countries could do wrong. And I think some people now looking back at it would argue that maybe Japan's model was great for one set of circumstances, but the model was not so great for the circumstances of a later period. And it may be that China's model has been great for the 1980s and 90s and this decade, but maybe the next decade or the next decade it will look less suitable. And then the question is, can the regime adapt? And obviously the political issue in China is a major one, right? That's the key fragility that no one can estimate as to how that's going to play out. I find it very unlikely. Once again, I hardly would portray myself as an expert on domestic Chinese politics, but just in terms of comparisons with other countries, that a country with a growing urban middle class is going to remain an authoritarian party state forever. And if it's not going to remain authoritarian forever, then how will it transition to something else? And will that be peaceful? Will that slow economic growth? What effect will that have on economic growth? That's very hard to say. So lots and lots of question marks. And I would be very, very skeptical of these, these projections. That the National Intelligence Council has to do this because they're tasked to do it. So they have to come to the policymakers and present them with these scenarios of the future of the world. And most of it, since it's all incremental in most cases, makes sense. That's the way the world typically works. But there are also surprises out there, and we should be prepared for them. If you look back at the countries that were regarded as great successes, I've often wanted one of my graduate students to go back to 1960, 1970, 1980, and then look at the list of countries, 1950 even, the developing countries that were going to be the great success stories of the next decade. I think you'd be very surprised if you looked at them then a decade or 2 decades later. Right? 1960, probably, certainly 1950, the Philippines and Burma would have been top of the list for many people in terms of prospects for developing countries. Now, Burma is a country with resources, had a highly educated population, it was a democracy, and look at it today. It's a disaster. If you look at 1970, it would have been the oil producers, right? All of the oil producers were going to be the great future economic powers. Venezuela, right? Great prospects. And we now think of petroleum as being a curse on economic development. At least there's a strong argument about that, natural resource curse. So I'd be just be skeptical and expect some bumps in the road in the BRICS. The BRICS are, I mean, we've already seen in the case of Russia, there are those who think Russia should be taken out of the BRICS because of Russia's performance during the economic crisis, which was pretty catastrophic. I mean, they had a big, big recession, at least temporarily. After a big oil boom, they then came crashing down at the time of the Great Recession. So whether Russia even belongs in this group is a good question. Yeah?
Do you see a correlation between, as these countries that we're talking about become increasingly wealthy, China and India, for example, do you see within the next 50 years a correlation between their wealth and a significant rise of people out of poverty in these regions?
Oh yes, no. China probably more than India, I believe, has done. It's been a remarkable job in lifting people out of poverty. The progress the world has made against poverty in the last 20 years or so has largely been because of China, or East Asia, I should say, in general. The East Asian development, and now India. The absolute numbers, and particularly the percentages of their populations that are in poverty in China have fallen dramatically. Now, whether that will continue at the same rapid pace as they move forward, given the easy part of the anti-poverty work has been done. In China's case, a large part of it was simply the rural economic reforms that were instituted in the early 1980s. I mean, my understanding of it is, and here, if there are China experts here, they can correct me, but it was sort of, if you take away the errors of Mao Zedong in the countryside and let the peasants actually produce food and engage in market activities, then suddenly poverty starts to go down very rapidly. And that's sort of what happened in China in the 1980s. So that was the kind of easy part. And a lot of the rural population lifted out of poverty. Of course, migrating from the countryside to the city is another easy way for at least some people to lift themselves out of poverty. Whether that will continue at the same rapid pace, I don't know. But so far, in many ways, without active anti-poverty programs, but just through sheer rapid economic development, these countries have done very well, indeed. And if they have more active programs on the part of the government, I think they would do even better, certainly, than they have in the past. There's no question that all of these emerging economies, and this is a major theme of this latest BRIC report at Goldman Sachs, have very large middle classes, large and growing middle classes, which are attracting the attention, obviously, of corporations around the world. Because, once again, the populations are so large that even if the middle class is not that big a fraction of the population, in absolute terms, it's a very large middle class. And that's the case for China, certainly for coastal China, and also for India, increasingly, as well. Yes?
I actually have 2 questions. The first is about China, and I'm wondering how you see the role, especially recently, China's major investments in Africa.
Yes.
They've made a lot of huge investments there. Economically, they've actually been critiqued for their role in the Darfur crisis. So how you see China's role in Africa, and whether that's sort of a mode of trying to shift the global governance terrain, maybe not taking leadership regionally, but sort of cross-regionally. So that's my first question. The second one is, I wanted to follow up a bit about your last point of actor proliferation and declining global governance, which thus far, I guess the way that you've used global governance sort of is contingent on the presence of nation states. And so I'm curious as to how you see the role of more transnational organizations that don't necessarily, rely on a nation state per se, but sort of transgress those boundaries, and how you see those organizations in terms of shifting.
Do you mean NGOs or corporations, or?
private corporations, transnational organizations,
Okay.
you know, like, I mean, you mentioned the WTO, World Bank, IMF,
Right.
obviously as multilateral organizations, but they're still sort of contingent on nation states and governments.
Yes.
But, you know, private corporations, humanitarianism, philanthropic organizations,
Right.
international NGOs, sort of institutions like that.
On the first question, that's a very good point, and I should have mentioned it in the talk. To the degree that China has gotten attention as a sort of dissident, if you will, from the current global governance, it is the role in Africa and its willingness to deal with states on the basis of economic self-interest. See, that's the interesting thing, though, once again. It's really just basically they're dealing with these states on the basis of economic self-interest, and their belief is that this is a legitimate exchange. These states are getting something for these deals, which is usually infrastructure, and then China gets mineral concessions or some other natural resource concessions, and that's the deal. How does that undermine global governance? Well, the incumbents, the EU and the US, have in Africa in particular been instituting policies of conditionality vis-a-vis these countries on issues like human rights, good governance. So they say, you know, we will give you aid, we will promote investment, we will do all these things if you do the following things. You will change your governance. You will be less corrupt. Right? So China comes in and says, we'll give you all these things without asking anything of you. So the incumbents, the EU and the US, look at this and they say, you're undermining global governance. Well, I guess in a sense they are, if you see this structure that the EU and the US and Canada and other countries have constructed that is trying to promote better governance in what have been notoriously corrupt governments and get them to think more about policies that benefit their populations and the like. And China doesn't do that. Now that gets back to the issue. It's interesting. This is China's policy of non-interference. They do not believe in conditionality. They don't believe that governments should go around, or international institutions should go around prodding governments to change their domestic policies. And this gets back to the so-called Beijing model, which is very, as I said, very pragmatic. The idea is basically you have to develop economically. China has discovered that one of the things that lets you develop economically is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. So they're going in, they're building ports, they're building roads, they're doing all this infrastructure, and basically they're not asking any questions. Right? I leave it to you to judge whether you think that's undermining global governance or not. Right? It's really a question, because I think this regime of conditionality vis-a-vis the African states, first of all, it wasn't always particularly liked by these governments in Africa, clearly. And second, it's not clear it's embedded in the type of institutional structure that the WTO, the World Bank, and other structures represent for China and for other governments. And that gets to your second question, which is about transnational forces. I mentioned here that this international sovereignty question, most of the emerging economies, even those that have very vibrant civil societies like Brazil, in terms of their international policies, really do not, I think, care for a lot of transnational governance. Right? I mean, in the case of a country like Brazil, there's a certain suspicion about multinational corporations, going back a long way in developing countries, but also they're not that fond of international NGOs either in certain respects. Their view of global governance, much more than the Europeans or even the United States, is a very intergovernmental view of governance, I think. And that may change as their civil societies become more lively, developed, and powerful politically as they have in Europe and the United States. But my sense is most of it, you can certainly see this at the WTO. At the WTO, the pressure from the NGOs has been for more transparency, more of a role, more of a formal role at the WTO, and in the IMF and the World Bank to a lesser degree. And the developing countries, and particularly these big emerging market countries, China, India, Brazil, have not been happy about that trend. They do not like it. And that once again gets to these sovereignty concerns. They want governments to be the gatekeepers between the populations and these institutions. The idea that there should be some direct role for other organizations that claim to represent these populations, rather skeptical, I would say. As I say, that probably will change with the domestic politics of these countries, and already you can see it, I think, in cases like Brazil, probably. China, it's going to take a lot longer, because civil society in China is much, much weaker. Much weaker. Yes?
I agree with you about the sort of shifting preferences, or not lack thereof, in terms of shifting preferences in terms of China and Japan. But for me, I think the big sort of elephant in the room is China's currency policy.
Yes.
And there wasn't a lot of discussion about that, and I wonder if you see that as sort of one of the major challenges that China's bringing to the table in terms of shifting norms.
There, once again, the rules are not so clear, right? Since the Second Amendment to the Articles of Agreement of the IMF back in the 1970s, countries basically are not required to fix their exchange rates. Of course, the problem with China, according to us, is that they are fixing their exchange rate. Essentially, the rule is that there is no rule. Countries have complete control over their exchange rate policy. Now, there is this phraseology in the Articles of Agreement about manipulation of exchange rates. That's where the crux of the matter lies. But what does that involve? Does that mean that you can't peg your exchange rate at all? You have to peg it at a realistic level? Not so clear. I mean, you're absolutely right. Certainly the critics of China, people like Fred Bergsten and the people at the Institute for International Economics in Washington who are quite critical of China, would argue that this is an area where China is really free riding or even violating international norms. But a lot of other countries are doing the same thing, kind of hiding behind China as well. And that's one of the reasons China's taking a lot of heat, because unless they change their exchange rate policy, the other Asian countries that are fixing their exchange rate are not going to either. So I'm not really defending China. I think it's much more of a question of what is really in their self-interest, because I think there's a strong argument they should change their exchange rate policy for their own economic interests, and it's now become caught in the politics of export interests in China, as I understand it, which makes it very hard for them to do that. It also gets harder for them to do it the more pressure they are seen as feeling from the outside, because then it gets to be a nationalist. You know, when the pressure was coming from the United States, the blogs in China apparently were exploding with nationalist sentiment about, you know, we can't give in on this issue. It just became an issue of national pride, which is kind of crazy for an exchange rate. I mean, you know, it's just a price. But still, that's the way it's seen. So I think it will be very interesting to see how this new framework that the G20 has designed will play out in practice. Will that involve more peer pressure on the countries in the G20 to adopt more realistic policies? Whether exchange rate, will there be trades between China changing exchange rate, the United States adopting more stringent fiscal policies? You know, there are various things one could imagine. But the G20 does have this new framework, which I suspect is going to become an empty shell, but in the middle of the crisis, they adopted it, and the idea is that there would be more international surveillance of macroeconomic policies, including exchange rates. And how that's going to work out, we will see. The next meeting's in Toronto, and then there's going to be a G20 meeting in South Korea. And so far, actually, a lot of these commitments have been taken more seriously than I would have expected. But whether that's going to continue, and whether it will affect a big issue like this exchange rate policy is a question. I mean, I think China was just about ready to budge, and then the European crisis ensued, and that makes it even harder for them because Europe is a big market, the euro is now declining, which means their export markets in Europe are getting hammered, and now they're very nervous again about their export industries, and that's going to make it very hard for them to move on the exchange rate, I suspect, immediately. But it looked this spring as if they finally were making hints that they were going to start to go back to the gradual policy they had before the crisis. There was somebody I saw, yeah, back there, but you hadn't spoken yet. Yeah.
Your pessimism wasn't quite as pessimistic as I thought it would be.
Okay.
Some of the points up here.
No major power war, it's true.
Some of the points up there would seem to militate against the formation of an Asian alternative, a regional alternative, so maybe defensive regionalism is less likely. And if a regional alternative is less likely, then the choice boils down to something like the current system,
right,
or something like letting the current system decay or collapse.
Right.
And faced with that choice, where do you think the rising Asian powers would?
No, I think that's putting it. I think that's putting it very well. I think, in fact, the big risk is probably the free riding risk. In other words, they kind of disengage, go their own ways. And don't invest much. You know, there's all this talk now about China being a responsible stakeholder. That's the word that Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, used about these countries. And what does that mean? And does it mean they have to be stakeholders in an unchanging system or not? I think these countries have all made, I think, very big bets on a particular economic strategy, which really does require an open international economy. Now, they may decide that somehow the system is, as you say, decaying, and they're not going to get what they want out of this particular system that keeps it open. That would mean moving to a regional alternative of some kind. In the absence of that, I think that they will eventually, continue to invest in it. I mean, certainly during the crisis, it was impressive that, even though they did not suffer as much from the crisis, I think one thing they all learned was the idea of decoupling, as it was called, was false. In other words, there was some talk out there before the crisis, before the Great Recession, that the emerging markets were growing so rapidly and their growth was increasingly based on domestic factors that the international economy was becoming less and less important for them, and they had been decoupled from the international economy. What they learned during the Great Recession was, A, they weren't decoupled. Their exports took big hits and their economies were shaken. But on the other hand, they recovered very rapidly. And that was partly because of the measures that were taken to see that the economy didn't spiral, that the world economy didn't spiral down into something worse than the Great Recession for them. So I think that lesson will persist, and they will probably invest more. But how much they will invest and whether it will be enough to make up for the declining share of the EU and the US, because let's face it, people in Europe and the United States are going to look at the system and say, hey, these Asian economies are benefiting more from this system than we are right now, so why are we investing so much in it, right? Or at least some parties in the United States and Europe might well feel that way. And whether the Asian economies and the other emerging economies will pick up the slack rapidly enough to stabilize the system and carry it forward is the big question. But I think you put it very well. I think that is the kind of the disengagement and allowing it to fray and finally to sort of slow motion disintegration would be the real risk, rather than some challenger like China sort of overturning the system like the 1930s, where you have Germany and Japan really coming up with very different models of the way that the economy should be organized.
Okay, probably maybe one quick question. We're a little over time.
Okay, yeah.
In view of the projections of many observers that the United States is headed over the long term for the same kind of fiscal problems as Greece, gigantic deficit budgets as far as the eye can conceive, and therefore this will only be dealt with by the government by simply printing money, and the influence that this would have on, talk about exchange rates, on the value of the dollar. What are the prospects over the rest, the next 10 or 20 years that the dollar will cease to be acceptable to the world, let alone Asia, as the world's reserve currency and main facilitator of international trade, and that indeed some other basket of currencies or special drawing rights or what have you will be substituted for the dollar, and what effect will that have on all of us here, especially the young people looking for jobs?
Well, I mentioned in the paper, I didn't mention in the talk, the head of the Central Bank of China. There was a series of articles posted on the web of the head of the Central Bank of China which proposed exactly that, which was in a very modest way giving a larger role to the special drawing rights of the IMF, which is making it a little more like an international currency. And there's certainly been some rhetoric, speeches and talk from Chinese policymakers that the dollar has too large a role, and the US government is kind of abusing its privileges. It's very much like the rhetoric that we heard from Europeans back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and from the Japanese in the era of the first Bretton Woods, right? It was that the United States is abusing its privileges, it's exporting inflation, it's debasing its currency, so on and so forth. We need to, at that time, the French wanted to go back to gold. At least some of the French policymakers did. But in every case, they wanted something else. But they didn't know how to get away from the dollar. And so we came to the system we have today where the dollar is still playing a central role. And now with the euro in deep trouble, which is probably going to persist as long as the trouble for the dollar, it's not quite clear what the alternative would be in terms of another national currency. The renminbi is not ready yet. There's no way. So then we get to this question of international currency, but that's a very long-term process. So you can do various things, as the Chinese central bank governor suggested, to around the margins, build up an international currency, an international reserve unit, perhaps in a way that it hasn't been built up yet. But long-term prospects. So I think whatever the world thinks, it's kind of stuck with the dollar for now. And unless the euro recovers in a way that looks a little unlikely over the next, say, few years, then if both of those look unattractive, I think your alternative of building up some sort of an international currency might become more attractive. But boy, the kind of negotiating and transaction costs getting from here to there, that would be really quite large. The benefits for the younger people in the room would be that the American government would have to act within constraints like other governments in the international economy. Maybe not as tight a constraint as Greece, I think that's an exaggeration, but nevertheless constraints. So in other words, unlike my generation, you wouldn't be able to run fiscal deficits as far as the eye can see. You'd have to deal with your international constraints in the way that a typical government would. And that might be a good thing. I think more constraints on the United States actually might be a good thing overall. Anyway.
Well, on that note, we have a little gift for the National Studies, but please join me in thanking.